We like to think that civilization is strong. We believe that laws, morals, and empathy are built into our DNA. But history has a terrifying way of proving us wrong. It shows us that civilization is nothing more than a thin coat of paint. And if you scratch it, if you add enough hunger, enough thirst, and enough fear, the monster underneath reveals itself. In 1816, a French frigate ran aground off the coast of Africa. There were not enough lifeboats. So 147 people were put onto a makeshift raft and set adrift. When they were found 2 weeks later, only 15 were alive. The rest hadn't just died. They had been butchered, they had been eaten. This is the story of the Medusa. The story of how quickly human beings can turn into wolves. To understand the horror of the raft, you first have to understand the incompetence that built it. The year is 1816. Napoleon has been defeated and the French monarchy has been restored. King Louis XVIII is on the throne, and he wants to project power. He sends a fleet to Senegal, West Africa, to reclaim a colony from the British. The flagship of this fleet is the Méduse. But there was a problem. The captain appointed to lead this mission, Auguste de Roy de Chaumares, was not chosen for his skill. He was a political appointee, a relic of the old aristocracy who hadn't sailed a ship in over 20 years. He was arrogant, out of touch, and dangerously incompetent. He treated the ocean like a road, and his crew like servants. On board, the Méduse were 400 souls. Soldiers, settlers, the new governor of Senegal, and his family. From the moment they left port, it was a disaster. Captain Chaumares ignored his navigators. He tried to outrun the other ships in his fleet just to arrive first. He cut corners, taking dangerous routes close to the shore to save time. On July 2nd, the inevitable happened. In calm seas and clear weather, through sheer stupidity, Chaumares ran the Méduse aground on the Arguing Bank, a sandbar miles off the coast of modern-day Mauritania. The ship wasn't destroyed, it was just stuck. But as the hull began to groan and crack, panic set in. And then came the math. The deadly math that haunts every shipwreck. There were 400 people on board. The lifeboats could only carry 250. A plan was hatched. The upper class, the governor, the captain, the officers, and the wealthy passengers took the lifeboats. For the remaining 147 people, soldiers, sailors, and a few unlucky civilians, a raft was constructed from the ship's masts and beams. It was a monstrosity. 20 meters long, 7 meters wide, heavily built, and utterly unseaworthy. The plan was for the lifeboats to tow the raft to the African coast, which was only 60 miles away. It would be a hard journey, but they would survive. Or so they thought. As the convoy set off, the raft was a nightmare. It was so overcrowded that the men couldn't sit down. They stood pressed shoulder to shoulder, in water up to their waists. The raft had no steering, no oars, and almost no food. Just some soaked biscuits and casks of wine, but they had hope. They were being towed by the lifeboats. They watched the captain and the officers rowing ahead of them, and then, the moment that defined the tragedy happened. The raft was heavy. It was dragging the lifeboats back, slowing them down. Captain Chaumares, sitting dry and safe in his boat, made a cold calculation. He decided that the 147 people on the raft were dead weight. He gave the order. The tow rope was cut. The people on the raft watched in disbelief as the rope fell into the water. They screamed, they begged, but the lifeboats didn't turn back. The captain, the governor, and the officers rowed away, leaving 147 men and one woman alone in the middle of the ocean, without a compass, without food, and without hope. The betrayal was absolute. Hell didn't wait to arrive. It started on the first night. Panic turned to madness almost instantly. The men, realizing they had been left to die, opened the wine casks. They didn't drink to survive. They drank to forget. Drunkenness mixed with terror created a violent, psychotic cocktail. By the second night, the raft had become a battlefield. Hallucinations set in. Men believed they saw land, or ships, or beautiful cities under the water. In their delirium, some drew their sabers and attacked their comrades. Others tried to destroy the raft, screaming that they wanted to end it all. The officers on the raft, trying to maintain order, started shooting. It was a massacre in the middle of the ocean. By the time the sun rose on the third day, 60 people were dead. Their bodies littered the wooden beams, tangled in the ropes. But the real horror was the hunger. 3 days. That's all it took. The biscuits were gone. The wine was running low. The sun blistered their skin during the day, and the ocean froze them at night. They were surrounded by water, but dying of thirst. They were surrounded by death, but desperate for life. And then someone took a knife and cut a piece of flesh from a corpse. It started in secret. A few men hiding their faces, eating the bodies of those who had died the night before. But shame is a luxury of the well-fed. Soon it was open. It was systematic. They stripped the meat from the bones of their friends. They hung strips of human flesh on the mast to dry in the sun. The raft became a floating butcher shop. The strong ate the weak. The sane became the insane. By the fourth day, only 67 people were left alive. But the horror wasn't over. The remaining survivors, the strongest ones, held a council. They looked at the sick, the wounded, and the weak. They calculated that these people were consuming precious wine but had no chance of surviving. So they made a decision that chills the blood. They didn't wait for them to die. They threw them overboard. The healthy threw the wounded into the shark-infested water to save the wine for themselves. It was a purge. A final act of calculated murder to ensure their own survival. Now only 15 men remained. They were no longer men. They were skeletons with sunburned skin, their lips cracked and bleeding, their eyes wild with the guilt of what they had eaten. They lived in a state of semi-consciousness, huddled together on a few dry planks, surrounded by the gnawed bones of their shipmates. They had crossed a line from which there is no return. They had survived, yes, but at the cost of their souls. On July 17, 13 days after the rope was cut, a ship appeared on the horizon. It was the Argus, sent back not to rescue survivors, but to recover the gold that had been left on the Méduse. When the crew of the Argus spotted the raft, they couldn't believe what they were seeing. They didn't see humans. They saw 15 hollow ghosts, waving feeble hands. The raft was littered with scattered limbs and drying human meat. The smell was so overpowering that the rescuers gagged as they approached. Of the 15 men pulled from the raft, 5 died within days. Their bodies were simply too broken to recover. When the survivors returned to France, the government tried to bury the story. It was an embarrassment to the king and the navy. Captain Chaumeries, the man who cut the rope, faced a court-martial. But his punishment was a joke, a light prison sentence. He never faced execution for the 130 lives he ended. But the story could not be silenced. One of the survivors, the ship's surgeon Henry Savigny, wrote a detailed account of the horror. It shocked the world. It inspired the young painter Théodore Géricault to create his masterpiece. He was so obsessed with capturing the smell of death that he kept severed limbs and severed heads in his studio to study the color of decaying flesh. Today, Géricault's painting hangs in the Louvre. Tourists walk by, snapping photos of the dramatic scene. They see a painting of a shipwreck, but they don't see the truth. The raft of the Medusa isn't just a story about a boat. It is a mirror. It forces us to ask the question we are too afraid to answer. If the ship goes down, if the food runs out, and if the rope is cut, who would you become? Would you be the one thrown overboard? Or would you be the one holding the knife?